In a world that is more connected than ever, it is strange, isn't it, how many people feel completely alone? We walk through crowded streets, sit in bustling cafes and scroll endlessly through screens filled with smiling faces, yet for some, there is no real hand to hold, no voice that truly listens. It is the great paradox of our time, surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. A man with no friends, what does that mean? At first it might sound tragic, a fate to be avoided at all costs. After all, we are told from childhood that friendship is the essence of life, that a man without friends is a man without joy. But is that always true? Or is it simply a reflection of what we've been conditioned to believe? You see, loneliness is not just an emotion, it is an experience, an uninvited guest that lingers in the quiet spaces of our lives. It creeps in when the world stops buzzing, when the messages stop coming, when you realize that there is no one to call, no one who truly knows your soul. And while some wear their solitude like armor, for others it is the slow erosion of the spirit. It is not simply the absence of company, it is the absence of connection. We live in an age where we are told that being alone is a weakness, a flaw that must be corrected. Society whispers, no, it shouts, that a successful man is a man surrounded by laughter, by camaraderie, by an unbreakable circle of friends. And so, those who find themselves standing alone often ask, what is wrong with me? But perhaps the better question is, what is wrong with the way we define friendship? Because friendship, true friendship, is not measured in numbers. It is not the collection of faces in a photo, nor the constant flood of messages on a screen. It is not the illusion of closeness, but the reality of understanding. And for many, that reality remains just out of reach. But why? Why does a man end up friendless? Sometimes it is by choice. Some find solace in solitude, peace in their own company. They do not seek constant validation nor the noise of shallow conversation. They are content in the quiet, finding comfort in the thoughts that fill the spaces where voices used to be, and there is nothing wrong with that. But for others, the absence of friendship is not a choice, it is a consequence. Life, as it often does, carves away at connections. People move, priorities shift, and the once vibrant relationships fade into mere memories. And then there are those who have been wounded, betrayed by those they once trusted, left wary of ever opening their hearts again. The walls go up, the doors close, and before they realize it, they have become the man with no friends. Yet there is something remarkable about solitude. It forces you to listen, not to the noise of the world, but to the voice within. It teaches you who you truly are when there is no one left to impress, no one left to please. It strips away the illusion that we must be constantly surrounded to be whole. But even so, man is a social creature, and isolation, when unwanted, can be a heavy burden. The absence of connection, of shared laughter, of a simple moment of understanding can weigh upon the soul. It can turn silence into sorrow and independence into imprisonment. And so, the man with no friends must ask himself, am I alone by choice, or am I alone because I have forgotten how to let others in? Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not in being alone, but in believing that it must always be this way. That friendship, once lost, can never be found again. That walls built for protection must never be torn down. That the past defines the future. But none of that is true, because the man who walks alone today may very well find his way into the warmth of connection tomorrow. And so what does it truly mean to be a man with no friends? It means different things to different people. For some it is freedom, for others it is loneliness. But what matters is not the label, what matters is what comes next. Because solitude can be a sanctuary, but it does not have to be a prison. And no matter how long one has walked alone, the path to companionship is never fully closed. There is a strange thing about the way society views friendship, isn't there? It is painted as the ultimate marker of a well-lived life, a proof of one's worth. The more friends you have, the more desirable you must be, the more loved, the more complete. We are told this story from the time we are children. Fairy tales, films, novels, all of them revolve around connection, around the triumph of companionship. And so when a man finds himself alone, when he stands in the silence of his own company, the world does not merely see a solitary figure. No, it sees failure. A man with no friends must surely be broken in some way, mustn't he? Surely something is missing in him, something that others have instinctively seen and rejected. But is that true? Or is it merely a construct, an idea imposed upon us by a society that fears solitude? Think about it. How often do we see people collecting friendships the way they collect trinkets, stacking them high like trophies to be displayed? Social media thrives on this illusion, reinforcing the belief that friendship is a numbers game. A man with 100 acquaintances is celebrated, while the man with none is pitied. But what of the quality of these connections? How many of these so-called friends would remain when the laughter fades, when hardship arrives? How many of them truly know the man behind the mask, the thoughts he does not speak, the burdens he does not share? There is a fundamental flaw in the way we measure connection. We have turned it into a commodity, a status symbol, when in truth, it should be something far deeper. And so those who find themselves standing outside the circle, those who do not have a ready-made group to surround them, begin to feel as though they are failing in some invisible test. They ask themselves, what is wrong with me? When perhaps the better question is, what is wrong with the way we define belonging? Because friendship, real friendship, cannot be forced, cannot be manufactured. It is not something one accumulates like wealth or possessions. It is not a performance, not a measure of one's value, and yet the world often makes it seem that way. And so the man who walks alone may begin to feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him, the questioning stares, the well-meaning voices that say, you should get out more, meet new people, make some friends. As if friendship is something that can be plucked from the air, as if it is a simple task rather than a rare and fragile thing. They do not understand that not all loneliness is a cry for help, that some men choose solitude, that some men find peace in their own company, and that this too is a valid way to exist. But of course there are those who do not choose it, those who long for connection but find themselves unable to grasp it. Perhaps they have been hurt before. Perhaps they have reached out and been met with indifference, with rejection. The world tells them to try again, to push past the discomfort. But how many times must a man extend his hand before he learns that not everyone wishes to take it? And yet, here is the truth that society so often fails to acknowledge. The presence of others does not always equal companionship. One can stand in a crowded room and feel entirely alone. One can be surrounded by voices, yet find no one who truly listens. Loneliness is not about the absence of people. It is about the absence of understanding. So what does it mean to be a man with no friends? Does it mean failure? Does it mean an inability to connect? Or does it mean something else entirely? Perhaps it means a refusal to settle for shallow company. Perhaps it means a life lived on one's own terms, rather than bending to the expectations of a world that fears solitude. And if that is the case, then maybe, just maybe, it is not the tragedy people assume it to be. Perhaps there is strength in it, dignity in it, a quiet kind of defiance in choosing to walk a path that so many fear. Because, in the end, what matters is not how many stand beside you, but whether you are at peace with the man who walks alone. There are many reasons why a man might find himself alone. Some are obvious, some are subtle, and some are so deeply woven into his life that he barely notices them, until one day he looks around and realizes that there is no one there. The world tends to see this as unnatural, as though friendship is something that should simply happen, like breathing, like the rising of the sun. But life is rarely that simple. People do not always stay. Connections do not always last. And for some, friendship is not a guarantee. It is a fleeting thing, slipping through their fingers, no matter how tightly they try to hold on. Some men choose solitude. They do not crave the presence of others, nor do they feel a void in their lives that needs to be filled with conversation and company. There is nothing tragic about this, though many would try to make it seem so. Not every man needs the comfort of companionship. Some find solace in silence, in independence, in the certainty that their thoughts are their own and theirs alone. They are not lonely, they are simply content with their own presence. And yet the world struggles to understand this. It pushes the idea that to be alone is to be incomplete, that a life without friends is a life unfulfilled. But a man who walks alone by choice does not see it that way. He sees it as freedom. Then there are those for whom solitude was never the plan, the ones who tried, who reached out, who hoped for something lasting but were met with disappointment instead. Some are abandoned by time, people move away, priorities shift. The bonds that once seemed unbreakable slowly fray until there is nothing left. Others are shaped by betrayal, by trust that was misplaced, by wounds too deep to risk opening again. A man can only be let down so many times before he stops extending his hand. He learns to retreat, to guard himself, to live within the walls he has built, not because he does not want connection, but because he fears the pain that often comes with it. And then there are those who never quite fit, the ones who have always been a little out of sync with the world, whose thoughts seem to move in a rhythm different from those around them. They watch, they listen, they try to step into the conversations, but somehow they always feel just a little apart, just a little separate. It is not that they do not try, it is that no matter how much they do, something remains missing. And so, after enough failed attempts, they stop trying. They withdraw, not because they wish to be alone, but because they have come to believe that they were never meant to belong in the first place. Society rarely acknowledges these truths. Instead, it places the blame on the man himself. It tells him he must be doing something wrong, that if he is alone, it must be his own fault. Be more social, they say. Put yourself out there, as if it is that simple, as if making friends is merely a matter of effort, as if all it takes is the right words spoken at the right time. But anyone who has ever truly felt isolated knows better. They know that connection cannot be forced, that not every attempt leads to something real. They know that some people are left on the outside, not because they do not wish to be included, but because the world does not always make space for them. So what happens then? What does a man do when he finds himself without friends, whether by choice or by circumstance? Does he mourn what is missing? Does he force himself into spaces where he does not feel welcome? Or does he learn to accept the life that has unfolded before him, to find meaning in the solitude rather than despair? Because here is the truth. There is no single way to live. Some will always need companionship and some will not. Some will find their way to friendships later in life, while others will walk their path alone. And neither is a failure, neither is wrong. A man's worth is not measured by the number of hands he can count on, but by the strength of the person he becomes in their absence. Perhaps, in the end, the question is not why a man has no friends, but rather whether he has learned to make peace with that reality. Whether he has come to understand that solitude is not always a curse, whether he has realized that, even in the quiet, he is still whole. There is a difference between being alone and being lonely. The world often confuses the two, as if the absence of company must automatically mean suffering, as if silence is always an unwanted void. But loneliness is not simply about being alone. It is about feeling unseen, unheard, disconnected from the world, in a way that goes deeper than physical presence. A man can stand in a crowded room and still feel utterly alone. He can have conversations, exchange pleasantries, even share laughter, and yet beneath it all there can be an emptiness that lingers, an invisible wall that separates him from those around him. The effects of this kind of loneliness are not always immediate. It does not arrive all at once like a sudden storm. It creeps in slowly, over time, settling into the corners of a man's life, until one day he realizes that something inside him has shifted. The things that once brought joy begin to feel hollow. The energy to reach out, to engage, to try, it fades. Days blend into one another, conversations become shorter, and soon the silence becomes a familiar companion, and the longer it stays, the harder it is to break free from it. Loneliness does not always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it is as subtle as a missed call that is never returned, a message left unanswered for too long. It is the gradual fading of friendships, the slow realization that people's lives have moved forward while you have somehow remained still. It is in the way laughter sounds distant, even when you are standing right there in the middle of it. And then, one day, you find yourself withdrawing, not because you want to, but because you no longer know how to do anything else. The mind is a strange and powerful thing. Given enough time, it begins to accept loneliness as a natural state. It convinces you that this is simply the way things are now, that there is no point in trying, No point in hoping, because the world has already made its choice. And so you tell yourself that you prefer it this way, that solitude is easier, that people are unreliable, that connection is overrated. You build walls, not to protect yourself, but because you have forgotten what it feels like to live without them. But loneliness does not just reside in the mind. It takes root in the body as well. It wears a man down in ways he may not even realize. It takes away his energy, his motivation, his ability to find meaning in the small moments. The world seems muted, colors less vibrant, sounds less engaging. Sleep becomes restless, thoughts become heavy, and the simple act of facing the day begins to feel like an exhausting task. The body, much like the soul, was not made to exist in isolation for too long. Yet, for all its weight, loneliness is not always obvious to others. It does not always look like sadness or despair. It can wear the face of someone who appears perfectly fine, someone who smiles at the right moments, who says all the right things. It can be hidden behind a well-practiced laugh, behind the habit of saying, "I'm okay," even when the truth is anything but. Because admitting to loneliness is not easy. It feels like a confession of failure, as if saying it out loud makes it more real. And so, many suffer in silence, convinced that no one would understand, that no one would care, even if they did. But here's the thing. Loneliness, for all its power, is not permanent. It is not a life sentence, not an unchangeable truth. It is a state, a moment, a chapter in a much larger story. And though it may seem all-consuming, though it may convince a man that he will always feel this way, the world has a way of surprising even those who have given up on it. Because even in the deepest loneliness, connection is still possible. It does not always come in the form of grand friendships or sweeping gestures. Sometimes it is found in the smallest of moments, a brief conversation, an unexpected kindness, a shared understanding with a stranger. Sometimes it begins with a single step, a single effort, a single decision to believe that life does not have to remain this way. A man who has known loneliness understands the weight of it, but he also understands the power of breaking free from it. And though the journey back to connection is not always easy, it is always possible, even for the man who has convinced himself that it is not. People like to believe that a man with no friends must be missing something, that he must be lacking some vital quality, charm, kindness, warmth, that would draw others to him. They assume he is difficult, awkward, bitter, that something in him repels the connection that comes so easily to others. And yet they rarely stop to consider that the opposite might be true, that perhaps it is not weakness or failure that leaves a man standing alone, but something else entirely. There is a kind of man who sees the world as it is, not as it pretends to be. He watches, he listens, he understands things that others do not. He is not easily fooled by smiles that hide dishonesty or by conversations that mean nothing. He has no patience for pretense, no interest in shallow connections that serve only to pass the time. And so, rather than filling his life with people for the sake of appearances, he chooses to be alone, not because he does not want connection, but because he values it too much to settle for anything less than what is real. It is not easy to be this kind of man. The world is built on a foundation of small talk, on relationships that thrive on convenience rather than depth. It rewards those who conform, who know how to blend in, who can pretend to care about things that do not matter. But the man who refuses to play this game finds himself set apart. He does not laugh when he does not find something funny. He does not speak simply to fill the silence. He does not surround himself with people who drain him, who demand his energy but give nothing in return. And so, he walks alone, not because he cannot make friends, but because he refuses to make the wrong ones. There is integrity in this. There is a kind of strength in knowing oneself so well that one will not compromise for the sake of comfort. But it is also a lonely path. A man like this does not always find others who think as he does. He does not always come across those who understand the value of silence, of depth, of something beyond the surface. And in a world that praises popularity over authenticity, he is often misunderstood. People call him distant, cold. They believe he does not care. But what they do not see is that he cares too much, that he cannot bring himself to invest in friendships that are built on nothing but convenience, that he would rather walk alone than waste his time on people who would not stand beside him when it truly matters. The truth is, The man with no friends is often the one who understands friendship the most. He knows its weight, its meaning. He knows that true connection is rare, that it cannot be forced, that it must be built on something real. And he knows that it is better to wait for something genuine than to fill the emptiness with illusions. But of course, understanding this does not make the loneliness any less real. There are moments, even for the strongest among us, when solitude feels more like exile than choice. When the silence grows too loud. When the absence of companionship becomes a burden rather than a freedom. Even the man who walks alone will sometimes wonder if he has made a mistake, if he should have accepted less, if he should have settled for company rather than waiting for true connection. It is in these moments that doubt creeps in, that the world's voices grow louder, whispering that he is the one who is wrong, that he has placed himself on the outside for no reason, that it would have been easier to bend, to compromise, to take what was offered rather than holding out for something more. But in the end, a man must live with himself. He must look in the mirror and know that the choices he has made were his own. And if that means walking alone, if that means rejecting the shallow in search of the meaningful, then so be it. There is no shame in solitude. There is no failure in refusing to accept less than what one deserves. A man with no friends is not always a man who has been left behind. Sometimes he is simply the one who saw through it all and chose a different path. Life has a way of moving forward, whether we are ready for it or not. The days pass, the seasons change, and the world continues to spin, indifferent to whether a man stands alone or among many. There is a certain inevitability to it, a quiet truth that cannot be ignored. No matter how much we dwell on the past, no matter how much we analyze the reasons for our solitude, time does not pause. It does not wait for us to catch up, it simply moves. And so the question is not why a man has no friends, nor whether he should have them, but rather, what does he do now? There is power in that realization. Power in understanding that life does not slow down to accommodate self-pity, nor does it grant second chances simply because one wishes for them. A man must decide what to do with the life he has, not the one he expected, not the one he believes he deserved, but the one that is in front of him. He can spend his days mourning what he lacks, longing for the friendships that never were, or he can turn his attention to what remains, to what is still possible, to what is still his, because even in solitude there is a path forward. Even without friends there is meaning to be found, work to be done, a life to be lived. It is easy to think that relationships define existence, that without companionship a man is somehow incomplete. But there is more to a man than the people who surround him. There is his mind, his craft, his purpose. There is the quiet pursuit of something greater, the dedication to something beyond himself. History is filled with men who walked alone, not because they were incapable of friendship, but because their path required it, because their focus lay elsewhere, because their purpose demanded their full attention. But it is not just ambition that fills the void. There is beauty in solitude, if one knows where to look. There is peace in the absence of noise, clarity in the stillness. A man who is alone is free in ways that many will never understand. He is free to think, to create, to move at his own pace. He does not answer to expectations, does not shape himself to fit into a mold that was never meant for him. He learns to appreciate the world, not through the eyes of others, but through his own. And in doing so, he discovers something rare, an unshakable sense of self, one that is not dependent on approval or acceptance. Yet, for all its power, solitude is not an excuse to stop living. A man who is alone cannot allow himself to become stagnant, to wither in his own isolation. He must move, must seek, must continue to grow. He must build something of his own, something that gives his life weight, something that makes his days matter. Whether it is through his work, his art, his discipline, whatever it may be, he must find his purpose and commit to it fully. Not as a distraction, not as a way to pass the time, but as a foundation upon which he stands. Because if there is one truth that cannot be ignored, it is this: a man who has built something of value, who has shaped himself into something strong and unbreakable, will never truly be alone. Even if no one stands beside him, even if no voices call his name, he will have himself. And that, in the end, is what matters most. So the world may look at a man with no friends and see something missing. But perhaps they are wrong. Perhaps he is not the one who is lost. Perhaps he is simply the one who chose a different road, who learned to walk it without fear, who understood that a man is not measured by the company he keeps, but by the strength of his own being. And if that is the case, then there is nothing to mourn, nothing to regret. Only the road ahead, waiting to be walked.